which generations from boomers to Gen Alpha are like the most hedonistic?
I think it's gotten to the point where people are like, you don't owe anyone anything, but I do think you owe people like kindness and human decency, responding to a
I
text.
think Gen Z implicitly fears loss because of we have had things taken away from us.
I don't understand where Gen Z gets off on like the, oh, I'm too busy to do that. Like, you're not too busy to even like a message.
A lot of us, I think, have the capacity to be like cycle breakers and to recognize where things are not going right.
Hi everyone. We are back. This is Washed Up in DC. I'm Abby.
And I'm Colin, and we're here to comment on the weekly news so you don't have to listen to the legacy media that your grandparents do. However, this episode might be a little bit different. We're kind of doing a topical episode talking about some trends between the generations, how they mesh, how they don't mesh so well, and maybe what it means for our current moment that we find ourselves in.
Everyone here who listens often knows that both Colin and I are Gen Zers, and we will constantly reference like our experiences in terms of what's going on in the world right now. So I definitely think it's something that we could comment on and give our insights on.
Yeah, and it's especially relevant because a lot of our political leaders and political elite tend to be, older, and that makes sense because the older that you get, the more you kind of accrue experience, and that leads to wealth and power and all that. However, I would say our leaders right now are kind of uniquely old and uniquely holding on to that power. So that's having real effects and ramifications for all of us, and I think something worth talking about and exploring.
Yeah, it's interesting when our leaders who are representing like us in our future are so much older than us because they also don't like understand a lot of what we're going through. Like the first thing that comes to mind right now is I think what a lot of people think of when it comes to the generational gap is like affordability.
Hmm.
Um people I always hear older people talk about how Gen Zers like to bounce around and they don't know how to stay steady, but I don't think we really have much of an opportunity to stay steady sometimes when buying a home costs way more than it used to. And I the gap of wealth there is a big generational difference. Like what do you think about that, Colin?
Yeah, I hear that quite often about how essentially Gen Z and younger has given up on the idea of ever owning a home. Personally, I understand and sympathize and connect with that feeling and the way that it does kind of change our habits relative to maybe the older generations. It was something more attainable to them, so they felt more confident saving and working toward that goal. Versus, I think a lot of Gen Zers are more willing to spend their money on sort of like recreational stuff because it's like, well, I'm not going to own a house anyway, so I might as well go on that vacation, or I might as well go out or do this or that, or get better clothes, or, if you're going to be renting and that's just the expectation for the indefinite future, it makes sense to me why that's sort of the way that Gen Z goes about money.
It even trickles out to other aspects of where money is involved. Like I know Gen Z and like young people are sober for the first time. There's like an increase in Gen Zers like maybe not drinking out at the bar because there is such a large amount of money to spend when you're buying drinks. I think when I'm out, sometimes like beers are 20 bucks, like at a baseball game or something, which is insane.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was thinking about the different generations preparing for this and thinking about sort of hedonism and which generations from boomers to Gen Alpha are like the most hedonistic. And it's not that I think that one is more or less than the others. I just think that it's harder to be hedonistic when you're Gen Z because like one espresso martini is like 20 bucks or something. And so it's like you can only do so much with what you have. Versus, I think, back in the day, if those things were cheaper, then you could go a lot harder and, yeah, go crazy.
And I think people drink like more often in their homes than at the bar now,
Mm.
which also could go into like people not really wanting to socialize. Like I think Gen Zers will something that I guess is like negative about the Gen Z commentary is sometimes when it's easier to be alone, you just will be. Um, which can be good and bad. I would lean more towards the bad part. I mean, good for your bank account if you're like saving money. I'm sure that that's like some of the reason why, and also how easy it is to like connect with people online versus in person is another added, I think, take to why maybe community feels a little different nowadays.
Oh, I think that's the worst part about being Gen Z. I absolutely hate it. I hate how atomized everyone is, like you said, because of the internet and because we can interact online. It sort of supplements or replaces the need for in-person interaction. I freaking hate that though. Like, yeah, I think it's ruined. It's made people very lonely for one, and it's also kind of ruined people's ability to actually organically form those connections. That's something we've talked about on this show quite a bit. Is like as a Gen Z person, you have to go out of your way to organically have those interactions and meet new people, join groups. It's like the energy that it takes just to do that is so much higher than it used to be because I think before the technology that was just the expectation is there was no other way to meet people other than organically or through communities or organizations and whatnot, shared organizations around shared values. And that I think is so lacking today. It feels like we've lost something as a culture.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like you said, we've talked about this so many times. I've referenced the book Bowling Alone
Hmm.
in regard to talking about community and building your own village and how bowling used to be like a way that people would like hang out after work and get to know each other and how people want to like get to know each other in the workspace or like in your community space, like your neighborhood, versus nowadays it's like so much easier to maybe stay in your comfort zone and stay on your phone. In terms of like social media and your connections that you've already built, I think a lot of people in Gen Z also going on top of this is that it's really easy for young people, what I've seen, to say that something isn't their issue, because they're like protecting their peace. I've also kind of talked about this on the show because I'm like a really strong advocate like against that. Like, as in, obviously, like I think that you as a person should always protect like your mental health first and yourself first because if you're not showing up for yourself, you can't show up for others. But I think it's gotten to the point where people are like, you don't owe anyone anything, but I do think you owe people like kindness and human decency, responding to a text. Like I don't understand where Gen Z gets off on like the oh, I'm too busy to do that. Like, you're not too busy to even like a message. And like that's something I think the older generation does way better than us for
Right.
sure.
They
Like,
understand like respect and etiquette, and when it comes to communication, there's certain standards that are just sort of expected as a courtesy, and they're more willing to like undergo those things. And like, yeah, I totally agree. Communication has really, in my view, broken down among Gen Z, and I again blame the internet for it. Whatever. There's probably a lot of factors, but certainly the internet too.
do you think that Gen Z has commitment issues?
Yes. 100%. And I think it also has to do a lot with our fear of loss. And particularly Gen Zers who are like 23, 4 or so, like our class, the class of 2020 in high school got really screwed over by COVID, where all of like the milestones that we had been building toward in our high school career got kind of taken away at the last second because of COVID and the pandemic and the lockdown and all of this. Our freshman year of college also got taken away in a crazy way, which Abby and I will talk about another time, because we were both at college our freshman year, and it was just the Wild West for sure.
We always reference it as the Wild West.
But yeah, I think Gen Z implicitly fears loss because of we have had things taken away from us for sure. And it was taken away from us because older generations stood to gain something from it, whether it was peace of mind, security, their health might have been more at risk during COVID, and yet we bore the brunt of that. And I think it's made a lot of people our age scared to commit to things because you are afraid of it being taken away from you at the last second. I've learned you have to resist that at every turn though, because that's no way to live your life in fear.
I agree with that. I I asked you that question because I knew how you were going to answer and I wanted a little jumping point. Um, I think that that fear of commitment falls within relationships, within commitment to your job, within commitment to your creative projects, within
Yep.
I think Gen Z is really good at this like big ideas, like big emotions, like confessions type thing, but when it comes down to like maybe the hard work and commitment of it all, it's so much easier to give up on it.
I think
And
millennials are that way too, but for a different
yeah,
reason.
I wanted to say that Gen Z might be like that because of like what you said, like loss. I also think it's
Hmm.
like maybe Gen Alpha
Nihilism.
will be like that. Yes. Maybe Gen Alpha will be like that too because of their attention deficit issues. Um, but why do you think millennials are like that?
Okay, with millennials, I think it's more of like a futility thing where like they were not brought up in such a way that they felt they were capable or competent to handle life's challenges, and like they're kind of known to be like the participation trophy generation where they were very kind of shielded, sheltered growing up, and they were told like if you follow all of these steps and you go to college and you get married and you get a job, then like life will just kind of unfold for you, and then that didn't happen because the system that was mostly set up by boomers and maybe older Gen X wasn't conducive to actually providing millennials with the opportunity to succeed. So a lot of millennials failed in a very catastrophic way, and they kind of never bounced back from it. And they, to me, millennials are very defined by, not all of them. Obviously, we're making huge generalizations here, and I know a lot of millennials that are very competent and impressive people. But I think as a generation, they're kind of defined by this sense of futility of like self-defeating in a way of like, why would I even go for it if it's just not going to work out for me anyway? And Gen Z, we have the nihilism, but I think we actually are pretty ruthless and believe in ourselves and know how to like pick ourselves up from a loss and keep moving. We're very cold and detached, rather than self-defeating. But these are all like different coping mechanisms. But I do I do personally find the flavor of the millennial self-defeating tendencies very off-putting.
Yeah, and like you said, these are like generational generalizations, but it's the point of talking about this episode, even speaking about Gen Z, like we will not be spared from criticism and what I think is wrong with our generation. How do you think, say, like the older generations, like boomers and maybe Gen Xers, have dealt with commitment?
I think commitment was oftentimes way more socially enforced back in the day. Like I'm thinking of marriages, and boomers were kind of starting to turn the tide in terms of accepting divorce as like a normal thing.
Hmm.
But also, they still kind of lived in this era where like their parents' generation was very conservative, very traditional, very religious, and they helped to reinforce those commitments among the boomer generation, where I think like there was just more of an expectation of like if you commit to something, it should be like a long-term, stable investment in a way. And like you said, with the younger generations, everything is so chaotic for us that like jumping around, changing things up on a dime, never really being tied down, like that makes a lot more sense given the I guess instability that we've grown up in and now find ourselves in even more.
I think it's also only natural to look at who has come before you, and what your parents have done for you, or maybe grandparents, or just like generations before you in general, and take things and appreciate them, but also on the flip side, take them and maybe not want to repeat certain things, which can, I don't think this is a Gen Z generate young generation specific thing, but it from my experience is definitely something that I see often when I'm speaking to peers when with about their parents or about like older people or people in the workforce who are older. They're like, I never want to do it like that, or I never want to do it like this. I think it's equally as important to maybe point out the things that are done right
Hmm.
and internalize that as well. It's really easy to naturally internalize the negative things. And it's something that I try to practice every day of like actually taking positive aspects of what I've learned and implement that fully.
I like what you're saying about actually taking the time to implement positive changes and to self-reflect. And I do credit Gen Z for doing that a lot more than, for instance, the boomers. And part of it is we had a lot more resources at our
Yeah.
disposal when we were growing up because of the internet. So this is the positive side of the internet now, where like, I mean, we were kind of inundated from like childhood to teenage years to now with like a lot of pop psychology kind of emerged, and a lot of Gen Zers that I know are very familiar with talking about like their own psychology, their relationship habits, and self-reflecting about things like that, those patterns that they would like to disrupt and change. And I find that impressive about Gen Z because a lot of us, I think, have the capacity to be like cycle breakers and to recognize where things are not going right, to kind of self-correct in a way that is admirable and very difficult. And I think we've had the benefit of the internet, we've had the benefit of those extra decades of research and conversations around self-understanding, and I think we value that in a way that other generations haven't.
Totally. I think it is I've I've never met a generation or people more self-aware than Gen Zers.
If only the self-awareness was enough to actually make the change, though, and that's where I
Yeah.
think we struggle, is in, like you said, the implementation of these things is a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, I was literally about to say that. Like, I think that we're really good at pointing out our flaws or pointing out where what needs to happen, but the action part of it, I almost think it's tied back to this, like what I was talking about earlier, like Gen Z is really good at like big ideas and wanting to make this movement, but they're not good at like sitting down and actually making the commitment to do so. And when I'm saying they, like obviously I'm included in this. Like I'm not sitting here like talking trash about all of my peers. Like I think that there's so much that I could do to improve who I am or like my relationships or do some like self-reflecting, but there's always this like I don't know what it is exactly in terms of in terms of tying it back, I guess, to commitment and being surrounded by people who maybe aren't making all of the right decisions to do so. I wonder if like this community village aspect would also tie into it and make it easier if every single person around was also like, we need to make this change right now. Everyone stop using Instagram, you know?
Oh, totally. I know exactly what you're talking about, where a lot of things around, like Gen Z recognizes a lot of things around us are sort of inherently negative, and yet will engage with it anyway because there's no solid alternative. So like when it comes to the food that we eat, the medical system that we have in place, the harmful sides of social media and being online, and different like attitudes that we hold that we recognize are self-destructive and yet, engage in that anyway. I think like that's such a struggle, is knowing that the system is kind of broken in so many ways, and yet feeling like if we do want to change things, we're gonna have to completely like form a new path that's never been paved before, and that takes a lot of work. And I think a lot of Gen Zers kind of look at that and feel very intimidated and are, in some cases, they quit before they start because they are afraid of failure.
That is another thing that I kind of want to talk about in terms of Gen Z relationships, friendship wise, like romantic wise as well. I think Gen Z is really afraid of commitment in that aspect because, like, being in a relationship or friendship or whatever seems like to be a lot more serious now than maybe like older generations make it seem like, at least in my experience of talking to like older family members or like whatever. They're like, yeah, like that person was my boyfriend for like a month or 2 months or like whatever, and then it ended because it we didn't get along. I never hear about people having like 1 to 2 month long relationships anymore. And I think it's because people are so afraid of maybe failing in that aspect that they don't even want to try, even if it's like a short-term committed thing.
That's interesting. I know like the phrase situationship is a very Gen Z phrase and something that I think a lot of people can relate to of like you are not putting a label on it because the label seems like oppressive or scary and Gen Z doesn't really like labels. But then it can kind of lead to this effect where by not labeling it, you open yourself up to other kinds of getting hurt and um it's interesting because I think half of Gen Z is waking up and realizing like sometimes labeling things is actually better and healthier and more stable. And like a lot of my friends are getting married at this point now, and I'm happy for them because I recognize how difficult it is to commit, as we've talked about in our generation. And I see the people who are getting married or in long-term relationships as yeah, breaking that cycle that we've been talking about of fear of loss, fear of failure, fear of commitment. So I admire that about my friends.
Another thing I admire about Gen Z and like younger millennials, I guess, millennials in general too, is um, n- the lack of pressure to have children. I think the reason why we're even doing this episode was inspired by Teal Swan, a Teal Swan episode about like generational differences
Hmm.
and what was it like relationships or something like that.
Yeah, I think she was talking about specifically, well, partly parenting styles and how the different generations parented each other differently, which, has trickle down effects for the ways that these generations interact and see the world. So yeah, I'll link her video in the description because I followed her work for like 6 years now. She's great, very insightful, great about mental health. I think millennials and Gen Z and Gen X would benefit from her work a lot.
Yeah, and she said something about how millennials are the first generation to realize that having kids is a choice. Um, and I like really am proud of younger generations for realizing that, I guess, in terms of I think it's becoming a parent, becoming a father, becoming a mother is 100% definitely a choice and one of the most like important ones you can make because to have children and have them be raised out of obligation rather than being wanted has so many impacts on them. I can't even like I feel like that's its own like episode within itself.
Yep.
And kids are so smart and intuitive that they know when they're wanted versus when they're not, even if you're not saying anything negatively to them.
Hmm. Definitely. And I think a lot of the older generations were very driven by, again, like social prescription and the traditions that they came from, and their a lot of times religious beliefs. And those sort of preconceived ideas or assumptions about the world and how a person is supposed to conduct themselves in their life they provide stability and they provide a framework, and there's something to be said for that. But they can also be too rigid, and if it doesn't fit with a particular like individual or something, then it can be very harmful and damaging to them to just go along with whatever the social prescriptions are. That includes having children, and in that case, you're also opening up the children to be very hurt. And I think that's happened enough times in a row where the children wind up bearing the brunt of their parents' dysfunction that it became so overwhelming by the time like millennials and Gen Z rolled around that we're like, hell no, I'm not going to subject another future generation to that pain because I know exactly how that feels to feel like I'm stepping out in front of a freight train and like holding up my hand being like please stop.
Yeah, and another thing that I thought that was interesting, what Teal Swan talked about in terms of like family and having children, that's like different generation wise, like also ties back to the idea of having a village. I
Hmm.
really liked what she said about how people in Gen Z, like younger generations, childcare is so expensive and this like idea of having a village and having people like look after your own like in terms of like your neighbors or like friends without feeling like you owe them cash or something because you know that that favor will be returned eventually is dying out. Um, I think part of it, what she had said was part of it was people moving away from their homes, their families or whatever. And like, I mean, I'm living across the country right now, so I guess I'm guilty of this as well. But I think that you can attempt or at least try to make community like everywhere you go.
Hmm.
I think that's something that we've talked about a lot off and on camera of kind of being that spark in somebody's life and going against the grain of like, yeah, you can come up and talk to me and I will try to be more open. And I do want you to know that I I like am proud of you.
Definitely. And the ways that I think back in the 40s and the 50s and 60s, people lived in these towns where everyone kind of knew one another, and
Mhm.
that can be very limiting in its own way, where those social, again, norms and prescriptions can be very confining to some people. However, there's something to be said for it in the way that it provides a stable environment for people to come up in and to feel connected to something and to have many resources to pull from. Like let's say a kid's having a problem, but they don't feel like they can go to their parent for it. Well, they can go to like a teacher or their grandparents who live next door, or an aunt and uncle or something like that. And they just had more resources. And now that people are all spread out and the trend is to kind of, I don't know, forge ahead on your own, go out, live independently, and it's been all about like independent living for a couple decades now, I would say. There's been that push. The communities have broken down, the families have broken down, and then we're in single family houses, and then oftentimes there's divorce, and then it's like not even a single family house anymore. So it's further being like segmented, and people I think are finding themselves increasingly isolated as a result of that breakdown. And it creates loneliness and it creates people who don't feel like they have resources when they have problems. And I think that's a large cause of not the only cause, but a large cause of the mental health crisis that Gen Z found themselves in.
hmm I do think it's good that Gen Z, I mean, we kind of mentioned mental health, but that is another thing I'm really proud of in the differences of like Gen Z versus like maybe the older generations. Um, maybe we do need more action-based items, but the popularization of like talk therapy
Hmm.
amongst our generation versus like older generations, especially maybe immigrants, at least and at least in my experience, like I think about like older Filipinos, for example, who are just like so against that and think it's like if you're doing something like that therapy, you're crazy, which isn't the
Stigma,
case.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I think that's another thing that is really impressive about our generation in particular.
Yeah, I also appreciate that shift where I think people now understand implicitly like the mind and the body are very interlinked. And in the same way that you train your body, exercise, which is something that's only been a trend since like I don't know the 70s and 80s, was I think when people started exercising recreationally more so.
Yeah.
But now people realize in addition to training your body, you also have to treat your brain the same way because I mean your brain and body are one and the same essentially. Um, and so yeah, that has led, I think, in a very healthy way to the breakdown of that stigma that people would just label people like crazy if they ever were experiencing mental difficulties. They weren't really seeking out solutions for it. It was just like, oh, that's just who they are, and we'll just like let them figure it out on their own. And yeah, people suffered a lot because of that. I'm glad we find ourselves in a different world.
The idea of like older generations and how they kind of had to just like smile through it and not talk about things, I think is also something that is often passed along through generations of like
Mhm.
a, oh, I'm just going to not talk about this, not deal with it and ignore it, and then we will be okay because if we don't talk about it, then it's not real. And I think that's something that a lot of a lot of even Gen Zers, like maybe even Gen Alphas, I don't really know, should maybe reflect on if they can, like in terms of, I guess, conflict re resolution is an important one, and being able to talk about it with your friends, your partner, or your family, even if that's something that you weren't raised with.
Yeah, so we're running down on time here, but I wanted to make sure we got to the elephant not in the room, Gen X. What do we think about them? I feel like they're just kind of watching everything slide and like go to hell in a lot of ways, and they're like, "Well, I hope you guys figure that out." But like, I don't feel like Gen X has really asserted itself to make a stand to kind of wrest the power away from the baby boomers who have just clung on to the last like little bit of authority that they ha still have. So what do we think about Gen X and their kind of in-between role between the boomers and millennials and younger?
Aren't they known as like the forgotten generation or something like that? Or is that a different generation?
I, yeah,
We're not
I know
even
what you're talking
remembering.
about. I know what you're talking about. If they didn't want to be forgotten, though, they should have made themselves less forgettable. Like,
I don't know. I don't know. It's strange because like my parents are Gen Xers. I know a lot of Gen Xers who like are around that age who I work with, who I have family and stuff. And I mean, I don't even think Gen X has like a defining generational attitude to things in the way that like millennials, boomers, and Gen Z and now Gen Alpha
I
do.
find that they're very fine people who just kind of keep their heads down and like, go through their own lives and like kind of keep to themselves in a respectable way. But I don't think they take enough of a stand. I think they're terrified of their parents' generation of the boomers and have not done enough to be like, okay, it's our time now. Like you had your time. And in fact, I don't think we've had a Gen X president other than maybe Obama, if he qualifies as that. Um, We've mostly had boomer presidents, including the last several. A lot of them were born specifically in the year 1946. It was like Clinton, Bush Jr., Trump, Biden. They were all born like right around that year of 1946. And that's the people who've been leading our country for a couple decades at this point.
Yeah, what is Vance? Is he Gen Xer?
I feel like he's like older millennial, if I had to guess.
Oh God. Okay, maybe we should have done our research on this. But I'm like, yeah, like where are they? Where did they go? They're just riding it out until they can be old and retire too.
Which is fine. Like they were kind of the last people for whom the system actually functioned well enough that they could make it. But I think now they've kind of left millennials and Gen Z to the wolves, and like we're all looking around like, hey, would have been nice like if you had I don't know, taken a little bit more of an active role in helping to shape the world that we're moving into. But if you're not going to do it, I guess we will.
Yeah, interesting thing that people have fallen into, and also interesting to talk about the differences between each of the generations and how it still continues to affect all of us to this day.
Yeah, I think we could definitely do something like this again because there's so much more to say. And again, we're speaking in very general terms, so there's no like definitive hard and fast rules here. But I do think it's fun and interesting and kind of taps into each of our own interests about people and relationships and psychology and patterns. And yeah, how that all kind of coalesces into where we find ourselves in the current moment.
Yeah, Colin and I love a little culture talk every once in a while. Maybe it's maybe it's good that there's not anything super pressing to talk about in the news right now, but I know I'm gonna eat my words when something crazy happens. So I'm glad that we got the chance to record this one.
Yeah. All right. We made it a week without anything catastrophic happening, so let's
Knock
keep
on
it
wood.
rolling.
Washed
Washed
up
up
out.
out.